The gentle hum of the restaurant was a melody of clinking glasses, soft laughter, and the distant sizzle from the kitchen, a perfect soundtrack for a perfect evening. I sat at a corner table, bathed in the warm, honeyed glow of a vintage chandelier, and thought to myself that at 42, I had finally understood what true contentment felt like. It wasn't a wild, heart-pounding thrill, but a quiet, steady warmth that settled deep in your bones. It was the feeling of being exactly where you were meant to be. Across from me, my husband, Mark, smiled. It was the same smile that had captured my heart in a crowded university library 2 decades ago. A little crooked, endearingly shy, but reaching all the way to his kind, blue eyes. He raised his glass of red wine in a silent toast to me. "Happy birthday, my love," he mouthed. I smiled back, my heart swelling with a familiar, comforting love. Beside me, our 7-year-old son, Leo, was meticulously arranging sugar packets into a fortress on the white tablecloth, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was the center of our universe, a bright, curious boy with his father's eyes and my unruly brown hair. He looked up, catching my gaze, and his serious expression melted into a wide, toothy grin. "Mommy," he said, "you look like a queen tonight." "And you, my darling, are my little prince," I replied, ruffling his hair. It was all so perfect. The restaurant, with its rustic charm and whispered elegance, was my favorite. Mark had remembered, of course. He always remembered the little things, the way I liked my coffee, the name of the obscure Swedish film that made me cry, the fact that I preferred gardenias to roses. His attentiveness was the bedrock of our marriage, a constant reassurance that I was seen, that I was cherished. We had built a beautiful life together, a sanctuary of trust and shared dreams. There were no secrets in our house, only the open, easy comfort of 2 people who knew each other completely. "I hope you're ready for a surprise," Mark said, his eyes twinkling as he signaled to someone over my shoulder. A moment later, a young waiter, no older than 20, approached our table. He was carrying a small, beautifully decorated chocolate cake, a single glowing candle flickering in its center. He moved with a nervous sort of grace, his dark hair falling over his forehead as he carefully placed the cake in front of me. "Happy birthday, ma'am," he murmured, his voice soft. Leo gasped with delight, his sugar packet fortress forgotten. The soft, familiar notes of the birthday song filled our little corner of the restaurant. Mark's deep baritone led the way, and Leo's enthusiastic, slightly off-key voice joined in. I closed my eyes, breathing in the sweet scent of chocolate and wax, and made a wish. It wasn't a wish for something I didn't have, but a simple, heartfelt prayer of gratitude for everything I did. For this love, this family, this perfect, unblemished moment. I blew out the candle and the world came back into focus. "What did you wish for, Mommy?" Leo asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "If I tell you, it won't come true," I whispered, leaning in to give him a hug. His small arms wrapped tightly around my neck and I held him close, burying my face in his soft hair. It was in that moment of pure, unadulterated love that he chose to speak. His voice was a tiny, barely audible breath against my ear, a secret meant only for me. "I saw Daddy with her again," he whispered. The words were so unexpected, so out of place in our perfect evening, that my mind struggled to process them. For a second, I was sure I had misheard. I pulled back slightly, looking into his innocent face. "What was that, sweetie? I didn't quite hear you." He leaned in again, his expression serious. "I saw him, Mommy, in the park yesterday. Daddy was with her again. The sad lady." A chill snaked its way down my spine, cold and sharp. The sad lady? Again? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A child's imagination, surely. Leo had always been prone to inventing stories, creating fantastical characters in his games. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. I forced a gentle smile, trying to keep my voice light. "Oh, honey, Daddy was at work yesterday, remember? You must have been dreaming." I glanced up at Mark, expecting to share a knowing, parental look with him, the kind that says, "Oh, the things they come up with." But Mark was already looking past me, a flicker of concern on his face. He wasn't looking at me or at Leo. He was looking at the waiter. I followed his gaze. The young waiter, who had been discreetly waiting to clear the cake plate, had frozen. He stood a few feet from our table, his body rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped a silver tray. But it was his face that made the air leave my lungs. His eyes were wide, fixed on Leo and me, and his mouth was slightly agape. It wasn't just surprise on his face. It was shock. A deep, unnerving shock, mixed with something else. Something that looked like fear. Then, as if his muscles had suddenly given out, The tray slipped from his grasp. It clattered to the floor, followed by the deafening crash of 2 water glasses shattering on the polished wood. The sound ripped through the restaurant's gentle hum, causing heads to turn and conversations to halt. Mark was on his feet instantly, rushing to the waiter's side. "Are you all right? Don't worry about it. It's just a couple of glasses." But I couldn't move. My gaze was locked with the waiter's. The sound of the breaking glass seemed to echo the sudden shattering of my own perfect world. He wasn't looking at the mess on the floor. He was still staring at me, at my family, and his eyes held a story I didn't understand. With a chilling certainty that settled into the pit of my stomach, I knew this was no coincidence. My son's innocent words and this stranger's violent reaction were connected. And the truth, whatever it was far more terrible than a simple, childish fantasy. The rest of the birthday dinner was a blur. The manager rushed over, apologizing profusely. Other staff members quickly and quietly cleared the broken glass, their movements efficient and discreet. Mark handled the entire situation with his usual calm competence, reassuring everyone that it was just an accident, a small disruption to an otherwise lovely evening. He paid the bill, leaving a generous tip, and guided us toward the exit. The young waiter was nowhere to be seen. He had vanished into the background as quickly as he had appeared, but his terrified expression was burned into my memory. The car ride home was thick with a silence that felt heavier than any argument ever could. Mark tried to fill it, pointing out the city lights, humming along to a song on the radio, but his cheerfulness felt brittle, forced. It was a performance, and for the first time in our life together, I felt like I was in the audience, not on stage with him. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the blurred streets, my mind a frantic whirlwind. I saw Daddy with her again, the sad lady. Leo's words echoed relentlessly, each repetition chipping away at the foundation of my certainty. Who was the sad lady? Why had Leo seen them more than once? And why, oh why, did the mention of it make a complete stranger drop a tray in sheer panic? I replayed the moment 100 times. The waiter's wide, fearful eyes. The way his gaze had darted from Leo to me, as if he was seeing ghosts. He wasn't just startled. He was implicated. He knew something. I risked a sideways glance at my husband. Mark's hands were steady on the steering wheel, his jaw set as he focused on the road. On the surface, he was the same man I had loved for 20 years. The dependable, honest man who packed Leo's lunch every morning and still held my hand during movies. But now, a shadow of doubt had fallen over him, and I found myself searching his familiar profile for a sign of deception, a crack in the perfect facade. The thought was a betrayal in itself, and a wave of guilt washed over me, hot and sickening. When we arrived home, the silence followed us through the door. The house, usually my sanctuary of warmth and comfort, felt cold and unnervingly quiet. I took Leo upstairs, my movements stiff and automatic, as I helped him brush his teeth and change into his pajamas. He was subdued, his earlier excitement completely gone, replaced by a quiet sensitivity. He seemed to sense the invisible storm that had gathered over our family. As I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with those big, earnest eyes. "Mommy," he whispered, "is everything okay?" My heart ached. I smoothed his hair back from his forehead, forcing another smile that felt like it would crack my face. "Everything is perfect, my love. Just a little tired." He seemed to accept this, his eyelids already drooping. "Okay, I love you, Mommy. I love you more," I whispered back, kissing his forehead. I stayed there for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, listening to his soft, even breaths. He was the innocent messenger, a boy who had unwittingly delivered a grenade into the heart of our lives. Whatever this was, whatever secrets were festering beneath the surface, I had to protect him from the fallout. Steeling myself, I went back downstairs. Mark was in the living room pouring himself a glass of water. He looked up as I entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Is he asleep?" "Almost," I said, my voice tight. I couldn't do it. I couldn't just pretend that the last hour hadn't happened. The question came out before I could stop it, quieter than I intended. "Mark, what did Leo mean? In the restaurant?" He stopped, the glass halfway to his lips. He let out a small, tired sigh and set the glass down on the counter. "Elena, he's 7. He has a wild imagination. You know that. The sad lady? It sounds like something from one of his cartoons." "It didn't sound like a cartoon," I said, my voice gaining a bit of strength. He was so certain. And he said again, as in more than once. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I knew well. "Honey, I was at the firm all day yesterday. I was in back-to-back meetings until 7. You can check my calendar. Call my secretary if you want. I don't know what he thinks he saw, but it wasn't me. His defense was immediate, detailed, almost too detailed. And the waiter? I pressed, watching his face closely. What was that about? You saw his reaction. He looked terrified. The kid was probably on edge. He looked new, nervous. Maybe he has a history of fainting or panic attacks. I don't know, Elena. It was a bizarre coincidence, that's all. He dropped some glasses. He tried to take my hand, to pull me into a hug, but I instinctively took a step back. His face fell. The hurt in his eyes was so genuine, so familiar, that for a moment I almost believed him. I almost let it go, dismissed it all as a combination of a child's fantasy and a clumsy waiter. It would be so much easier to believe the simple lie than to face the terrifying, complex truth. But my gut, that deep, primal instinct that had guided me my whole life, was screaming that this was real. I'm just tired, I lied, wrapping my arms around myself. It's been a long day. Of course, he said, his voice soft again. Happy birthday, by the way. I'm sorry the evening ended on such a strange note. I didn't answer. I went upstairs to our bedroom, the room that had witnessed 20 years of our life, our love, our shared vulnerabilities. But tonight it felt different. It felt like his side of the bed was a foreign country, a place I was no longer allowed to enter. I laid awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was filled with unanswered questions and the ghost of a sad, unknown woman. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the soul, that sleep would not come until I had found the truth. The morning light felt intrusive, exposing the dust motes dancing in the air and the dark circles under my eyes. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the scene at the restaurant on an endless, torturous loop. Mark had left for work early, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. Thinking of you. Let's have a real celebration tonight. I love you. The words, which would have warmed my heart just 24 hours ago, now felt like ash in my mouth. Love felt meaningless without trust, and trust was a shattered thing at my feet. I knew I had a choice. I could confront him again, armed with nothing but a child's confusing statement and a gut feeling. He would deny it again, perhaps more forcefully this time, and the chasm between us would grow deeper, filled with resentment and unspoken accusations. Or I could try to find the one person who could give my suspicion a solid form, the one person who shared the knowledge that had crashed onto our table along with those water glasses, the waiter. The thought of going back to the restaurant filled me with a paralyzing anxiety. It felt like returning to the scene of a crime. What would I even say? How could I approach a complete stranger and demand he explain the look of terror on his face? But the alternative, living in this suffocating fog of doubt, looking at my husband and son and feeling my world slowly tilt off its axis, was infinitely worse. After dropping a still subdued Leo at school, I drove to the restaurant. It looked so different in the harsh light of day, stripped of its evening magic. It was just a building, bricks and mortar, holding a secret I desperately needed to uncover. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes, my heart pounding against my ribs, before I finally found the courage to get out. I walked in, and the lunchtime hostess greeted me with a polite, professional smile. Table for one? No, thank you, I stammered, my voice sounding weak and unfamiliar. I was actually hoping to speak with someone, a waiter who was working last night. He was serving the corner table around 8 o'clock. He's young, with dark hair. The hostess's smile faltered slightly. I'm not sure. We have a lot of staff. Was there an issue with your service? No, nothing like that. It's a personal matter. The words sounded lame even to my own ears. She seemed about to dismiss me when a voice from behind the bar called out, "He's not here." I turned to see an older, gruff-looking man wiping down the counter. He was watching me with shrewd, assessing eyes. "The kid you're looking for, his name is Ben. He called in this morning. Quit." My blood ran cold. He quit? Why? The man shrugged, his expression unreadable. Didn't say. Just said he couldn't work here anymore. Left us in a real bind for the lunch shift. He gave me a long, hard look. You were the woman from last night, weren't you? The birthday party. The crash. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He let out a heavy sigh and jerked his head toward the back. His locker is in the staff room. He'll have to come back for his things eventually. You can wait if you want, but I'm not promising anything. It was a sliver of a chance, but it was all I had. Thank you, I said, my voice filled with a gratitude that seemed to surprise him. I found a small, uncomfortable chair in the staff corridor, a place that smelled of bleach and old coffee, and I waited. I waited through the entire lunch rush, listening to the muffled sounds of the restaurant, feeling invisible and increasingly hopeless. Just as I was about to give up, the back door creaked open, and he appeared. Ben. He looked even younger in the daylight, his face pale and drawn. He froze when he saw me, his eyes widening with the same fear I had seen last night. He looked like a cornered animal. "Please," I said, standing up slowly, trying not to spook him further. "Please don't run. I just need to understand." "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, his gaze darting toward the exit. "I have to go." "My son," I said, and his eyes snapped back to mine. "He saw my husband with a woman. He called her the sad lady. And when he said it, you looked like you knew. You have to tell me what you know. Please. My whole life is falling apart." My voice broke on the last few words, the raw, desperate emotion finally cracking through my composure. He stared at me, his own face a canvas of conflict. He swallowed hard, his youthful bravado crumbling in the face of my raw pain. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This is dangerous." "What is dangerous?" I pressed, taking a step closer. "Is he having an affair? Is that it?" He let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "An affair? No, it's not that. It's so much worse than that." He looked over his shoulder again, as if expecting someone to burst through the door. "Look, your husband, he's not who you think he is. The woman your son saw, her name is Maria. And she isn't sad, she's scared. And she has every reason to be." "Scared of what? Scared of whom?" My mind reeled. Maria. The name meant nothing to me. He finally looked me straight in the eye, and what I saw there made my stomach clench with a new kind of dread, one far colder and deeper than the fear of infidelity. "She's scared of your husband," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And so am I." He wouldn't say another word. He grabbed a worn backpack from a locker, fumbled with the strap, and then practically bolted out the back door, leaving me standing alone in the sterile corridor. The air was thick with his parting words with the name Maria, and with a terrible, chilling warning. He's not who you think he is. The problem wasn't a lie in my marriage. It was the man himself. I drove home on autopilot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The city streets seemed to warp and bend around me, unreal. "He's not who you think he is. She's scared of your husband." The words were a venomous poison seeping into every memory I had of Mark. His kindness, his gentleness, his unwavering calm. Was it all a mask? Was the man I had slept next to for 20 years a monster hiding in plain sight? When I walked through the front door, the house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, weighted down by the truth I was about to unleash. Mark was home. His car was in the driveway, and I could hear the faint sound of the television from the living room. He stood up as I entered, a hopeful smile on his face that died the moment he saw mine. "Elena, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," I said, my voice eerily steady. I felt strangely disconnected from my own body, a spectator watching a play reach its tragic climax. I went back to the restaurant, Mark. I found the waiter. His name is Ben. Every trace of color drained from Mark's face. He didn't even try to feign ignorance. He just stared at me, his blue eyes wide with a look I had never seen before. Not surprise, not anger, but absolute, soul-crushing defeat. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. In its place was the face of a stranger, a man haunted by a terror so profound it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. "He told me about Maria," I continued, each word a stone dropping into the abyss that had just opened between us. Mark flinched as if I had struck him. He staggered back, sinking onto the sofa as if his legs could no longer support him. He buried his face in his hands, and a sound I had never heard before came from him, a dry, ragged sob of despair that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of his soul. The story, when it finally came, spilled out of him in a torrent of guilt and shame that had been dammed up for more than 2 decades. It was a confession. It had happened 22 years ago, before he even knew me. He was young, just out of law school, celebrating a new job. He was driving home late, tired and unfocused. He took a side street he didn't know well, his attention drifting for just a second. But a second was all it took. A woman, Maria, stepped into the road. He hit her. The impact was sickening, a sound he said he still heard in his nightmares. He stopped the car, his heart hammering in his chest. He saw her lying on the ground, saw the unnatural angle of her leg, and he was consumed by a blinding, cowardly panic. This would be the end of everything: his career, his future, his life. So he did the unthinkable. He drove away. He was never caught. The police report mentioned an unidentified hit-and-run driver, but he followed the story, obsessed. He learned her name. He learned that the accident had left her with permanent, crippling injuries that required a lifetime of care she and her family couldn't afford. The guilt became a living entity, a shadow that followed him everywhere. When he met me a year later, he saw a chance for a different life, a life where he could be the good man he had failed to be on that dark road, but he could never escape what he'd done. So he began to live two lives. In one, he was my loving husband, Leo's devoted father. In the other, he was Maria's anonymous benefactor. For 20 years, he had been sending her family cash, large sums delivered through a complex, untraceable web, to pay for her medical needs. It was his penance, his secret atonement. He had never spoken to her, never admitted what he'd done. He just watched from a distance, the sad lady, as Leo had so aptly named her, a constant, painful reminder of his monumental failure. Leo saw me a couple of times. He choked out, his face still in his hands. I was putting an envelope in their mailbox. She came to the door once. I just froze. I never imagined he'd piece it together. And Ben, the waiter, was Maria's younger brother. He had only been a child when the accident happened, but he grew up in the shadow of its devastation, hearing the whispers about the faceless man who had ruined his sister's life and then tried to pay for his sin with blood money. He had recently gotten the job at the restaurant. He recognized Mark from a distance, having seen him once near their house, a specter of guilt his family both hated and depended on. When he heard Leo's whisper, he understood everything in a flash of horrifying clarity. His shock wasn't just at the coincidence. It was the terror of seeing the two worlds collide. The monster who had destroyed his sister's future, living a perfect, happy life with a son and a loving wife. He quit his job not just out of fear of Mark, but out of the sheer, unbearable weight of the secret. I stood in the middle of our living room, the room where we had hosted birthday parties and built blanket forts, and felt the entire foundation of my life crumble to dust. He wasn't a cheater. He was a criminal, a coward who had ruined a woman's life and hidden from the consequences for 2 decades. But he was also a man who had spent those same 2 decades trying, in his own flawed and secret way, to make things right. He had carried this unbearable burden alone, every single day of our marriage. I looked at him, a broken man weeping on our sofa, and I felt a dizzying storm of emotions. There was rage, a white-hot anger for the lies, for the monumental deception that had been the bedrock of our family. There was disgust at his cowardice. But underneath it all, stirring in the wreckage, was a profound and aching pity. I finally understood the melancholy I sometimes saw in his eyes, the slight distance he sometimes kept, the fierce, almost desperate way he loved Leo and me. He wasn't just building a life with us. He was building a shelter from himself. "I have to go to the police, Elena," he whispered, finally looking up at me, his eyes red and raw with unshed tears. "I should have done it 22 years ago. I can't run anymore." I didn't answer. I had no answers. The perfect, loving husband I had celebrated just last night was gone, replaced by this complex, broken stranger. The future I had believed in was an illusion. Could love survive a lie of this magnitude? Could forgiveness ever bloom in such poisoned soil? I didn't know. All I knew was that the truth, in all its devastating and complicated ugliness, was finally out. Our perfect story was over. And a new one, a story of reckoning and consequence, was about to begin. The path to redemption is never easy, and it rarely leads back to the life we left behind. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is not to forgive a lie, but to have the courage to face the truth it was hiding, no matter how much it hurts.